Virginia Woolf's concept of the androgynous mind is one that absolutely fascinates me. The concept was quite revolutionary for the time and sparks a lot of discussion even today. Throughout this video, I'll be looking at the context that inspired Woolf's thoughts and analyzing a couple interpretations of the concept. To properly set the scene, we're going to start at World War I, which ended up being a huge milestone for the feminist movement. When the UK joined the war effort, huge gaps opened in the workforce as men went off to fight. The problem only grew with the beginning of the draft in 1916. So, women rose to the occasion and joined industries that had been previously dominated by men. Women were maintaining railways, joining the police force, working heavy machinery, and even working in ammunitions factories to support the military. In an article on striking women, it's reported that almost 1 million women were risking their lives, working with dangerous chemicals like TNT to help resolve the munitions shortage. Their contributions were so huge that 80% of weapons and ammunition used by the British military were manufactured in factories that primarily employed women. Not only were women encouraged to fill in on the home front, the government also recruited thousands upon thousands of women for non-combatant roles in the military. Of these roles, nurses and ambulance drivers were two of the most crucial. This brought women to the front lines of battle, braving trenches and gunfire to bring injured or fallen soldiers home from the battlefield. Because the volunteer efforts of women were so pivotal for surviving wartime, there was little opposition and women were more empowered than ever before. Society could no longer ignore the capabilities of women, and the debate for equal enfranchisement finally made it to the parliamentary stage. In support of the enfranchisement of women, Home Secretary George Cave said, "War by all classes of our countrymen has brought us nearer together, has opened men's eyes, and removed misunderstandings on all sides. It has made it, I think, impossible that ever again, at all events in the lifetime of the present generation, there should be a revival of the old class feeling which was responsible for so much, and, among other things, for the exclusion for a period of so many of our population from the class of electors. I think I need say no more to justify this extension of the franchise." So, both in recognition of the heroic efforts made by women during the war, and because loss of life significantly lowered voter numbers, the Representation of the People Act was passed in February of 1918. This gave women at least 30 years old and possessing at least 5 pounds worth in property the right to vote. The act didn't grant women the same voting rights as men, but it was a monumental victory in the fight for equality. Unfortunately, the changes to gendered societal norms were always intended to be temporary. Patriarchal powers saw the inclusion of women as a necessary adaptation, but one that must be reversed when the war ended. In November of 1918, women were pushed back into domestic or low-paying positions as men returned from the war front. However, waves of active change had already begun, and both societal and cultural changes would not be so easily walked back. Such change was a playful exploration of gender expression. During the war, women often wore more masculine uniforms out of necessity. By the time the war ended, society had been familiarized with the idea of women styling themselves in more diverse ways. In fact, women in masculine attire was almost seen as a good thing by some. It reminded people of the heroic efforts made by women to keep their country afloat. This is where Vita Sackville West enters the stage. The popular author began exploring her sense of gender in earnest in 1918, after trying on breeches worn by farmhands at her estate. This decision, which seemed silly and fun at the time, activated parts of Vita that she'd largely suppressed. While presenting herself in a masculine way, Vita found comfort in the confidence to engage in her affairs with women. It's easy to speculate about how Vita Sackville West may have labeled her gender identity, because of her euphoria while cross-dressing, but I'd encourage against doing so. Instead, I think it's more important to recognize that gender fluidity granted Vita the freedom to overcome social limitations and embrace her sexuality. Before I move on, it has to be noted that Vita's experience is definitely not representative of the experiences of all queer women. While homosexuality between men was heavily criminalized, queer women were largely ignored. This reflects the kind of erasure that Virginia Woolf touches on in A Room of One's Own. Like essentially all other complexities of womanhood, relationships between women were seen as distasteful and ridiculous, generally unimportant and even impossible breaches of societal expectations. As Claire Matthew explains in her article on Vertigo, It's because of Woolf and Sackville West's financial and educational privileges that we're able to get a glimpse of how queer women lived during the early 20th century. The romance between Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville West had a hugely formative role on Woolf's life. Their bond is believed to be Woolf's first extramarital affair, and boy was it passionate. Confident and flirty Vita persistently pursued Woolf's affections as they bonded over their shared passion for writing, awakening desires that Woolf had never fully acknowledged. Though they had other extramarital relationships and maintained devotion to their husbands, both of whom supported the affair, by the way, their relationship with each other was by far the most intense. Looking at the relationship as an outsider from the future, the genuine love between the two is as palpable as their dynamic is funny. In a letter to Woolf, Sackville West wrote, "I am reduced to a thing that wants Virginia. I composed a beautiful letter to you in the sleepless nightmare hours of the night, and it is all gone. I just miss you, in a quite simple, desperate human way." In response, Woolf wrote, "I have been dull. I have missed you. I do miss you. I shall miss you. And if you don't believe it, you're a long-eared owl and ass." Their wildly different personalities were beautifully complementary in a way that encouraged growth and joy in a world that often worked against them. Inspired by Sackville West's fluid relationship with gender constructs, Woolf's concept of the androgynous mind first appears publicly during the 1928 lectures that make up A Room of One's Own. The idea is presented after the narrator expresses a strange sense of satisfaction at seeing a man and woman exit a taxi together. The narrator, intrigued by this feeling, wonders if the cooperation between men and women is also something that happens within the human mind. Do we all have male and female parts of our mind, and does unifying those parts achieve complete fulfillment? To elaborate on this idea, Woolf invokes Samuel Coleridge. "The truth is, a great mind must be androgynous," is one of Coleridge's most famous quotes, but we have very little additional content to analyze exactly what he meant by this. The full quote, which appears in a book called Specimens of the Table Talk of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, is, "I have known strong minds with imposing, undoubting, Cobbett-like manners, but I have never met a great mind of this sort. And of the former, they are at least as often wrong as right. The truth is, a great mind must be androgynous. Great minds, Swedenborg's for instance, are never wrong but in consequence of being in the right, but imperfectly." That's all we're really given about Coleridge's thoughts on the matter. The most I can confidently interpret from this is that predominantly masculine minds, like conservative journalist William Cobbett's, are confident, assertive, and rational, but often overly so, while androgynous, great minds, like scientist and philosopher Emanuel Swedenborg's, are more speculative and intuitive. In her lectures, Woolf expands on and makes her own interpretations of the quote. In her understanding, a man with an androgynous mind isn't one that shows any special amount of care and consideration towards women. Rather, he embraces both, at the time, stereotypically male and female characteristics. He meant, perhaps, that the androgynous mind is resonant and porous, that it transmits emotion without impediment, that it is naturally creative, incandescent, and undivided. To reach this harmony, Woolf asserts that you shouldn't be particularly concerned with sex and sex-related differences. To be a man or woman who both embroiders and shoots a firearm is to overcome societal gender roles and reach the height of creativity. This is where controversy arrives. For most of A Room of One's Own, Woolf had been highlighting the importance of emphasizing women's experiences and writing as a woman. Highlighting sexlessness in her explanation of the androgynous mind makes the entire lecture or essay extremely ambivalent, sparking a wide variety of interpretations and criticisms. Elizabeth Wright, in her article titled Re-Evaluating Woolf's Androgynous Mind, explains that critics generally fall into two camps. The first camp can be explained with this quote. For Woolf, androgyny is the capacity of a single person of either sex to embody the full range of human character traits, despite cultural attempts to render some exclusively feminine and some exclusively masculine. Here, Woolf's definition of androgyny and sexlessness is interpreted as a way to achieve inner balance. This interpretation actively opposes the societal enforcement of gendered roles and stereotypes, because sex-specific traits don't exist. Both traditionally masculine and feminine traits exist within everyone, and freely embodying the full range grants the freedom to express individuality. This quote helps explain the most common stance of the second camp. A number of critics have argued that androgyny is a conceptual red herring for Woolf because it offers a design for the mind which subsumes the female into the male. Thus, the androgyny which appears as liberation actually achieves the opposite result. Critics in this camp are using a patriarchal, period-accurate definition of androgyny to inform their analysis, a melting of opposing characteristics where one side dominates the other. Because women have been othered by society for so long, these critics hold the opinion that using androgyny to rise above this otherness would force women to reject femininity and allow masculine characteristics to dominate. This is especially problematic for critics in this camp because this analysis completely discards all the talk about empowerment and encouraging women to write as women. I hold a lot of understanding for this camp because it fully recognizes the tight grasp sexism had on society. However, I'm confident Woolf recognizes this too. Reading Orlando, a biography, is, I think, really important to fully understand what Woolf means with her explanation of mental androgyny. The story is heavily based on Vita Sackville West as a sort of love letter and offers a ton of clarity about Woolf's beliefs regarding sex and gender. Orlando's navigation of society as both a man and a woman compares the differences between men and women and blames them on socialization. This quote, I think, best explains the overall point. Different though the sexes are, they intermix. In every human being, a vacillation from one sex to the other takes place, and often it is only the clothes that keep the male or female likeness. Underneath the sex is the very opposite of what is above. Clothing throughout the story is used to symbolize gender's existence as a social construct. It is through clothing that the story keeps track of Orlando's gender identity as it routinely changes. When Orlando's wearing pants, he's perceived and treated like a man and able to utilize freedoms that are reserved for men. When she's wearing dresses, she's treated and restricted like a woman. However, as the story reminds us, the person underneath remains the same. This is ultimately Woolf's core meaning when exploring androgyny in both Orlando and A Room of One's Own. Gender identity and sex are not something that can be completely ignored because they have real-world implications about how you might interact with the world around you. However, gender has no bearing on who you are internally. Having an androgynous mind means embracing your identity as a whole and expressing yourself with total sincerity, rather than limiting yourself to how society expects you to behave.